Hi, this is Filiberto Amati, and I'm here today with Marco Bevolo, and we have the two esteemed guests for our next episode on the future of design and design thinking, and Marco is going to introduce them.
Thank you very much. We are thrilled to have Julio Mario Ottino, who is a Guggenheim Fellow and Dean at the Northwestern University. But most importantly, today is here as co-author of the Nexus, new book that he wrote with my dear friend. I hope you share the feelings, and design legend Bruce Mau. So actually, we are here today to have an informal conversation about the book, the content of the book, the design of the book, and what the book tells us about a better future. So I would like to start with a question that is actually very basic but very crucial. You mentioned somewhere that you worked on this book across several years of conversations, of exchange. What is that ultimately triggered the need to put all of your conversations into a quite remarkable and quite substantial publication like this, where there is an academic side, a design side, and a very strong message? What is the motivation? What is the spark?
I would say there was no spark. I mean, Bruce and I connected shortly after he did the massive change show in Chicago. I mean, there were some crucial points in the conversation. I think one point initially was a little table where I put art, technology, and science and compare them in different categories. That was one. Somewhere in the middle of those 10, 12 years, Bruce showed to me the 3 issues of transformation from Harry Holtzman. That was also crucial. At some point, the lessons of the book became important, but the conversations were frequent, but we never sort of discussed publisher or anything like that. And then maybe because I thought I was running out of time, at the end of 2019, I decided to assemble the notes we had. And this was over Christmas. And by about end of February, I had something semi-decent, kept working, just to have a test on how decent the notes were. I approached a couple of publishers. And once one said, yeah, we're interested in this, I told Bruce, I think it's the time to do it now. And then the pandemic and the lockdown started. And that's when basically for us, we were all at home. We live maybe 150 yards apart, but it was all by Zoom. We had lots of meetings every week. And at some point, we formalized a relationship with MIT Press, but there was no trigger. As I said, it was providential that at the end of 2019, I assembled the notes. And the trick was, and I will let Bruce comment on this, for everything that we included in the book, especially with images, there were probably 2 other images that were not included. In fact, I showed recently to someone who was interested more in design, an earlier version and this version, and I would say maybe 20% of the images in the book were in that previous version.
Yeah.
So no, it was a lot of accumulation, lots of conversations, which made the design easy because we knew exactly what we both like. And but it was no, people ask about disagreements. I don't think we ever had one. No.
Well, actually, with Bruce, it's total nonsense to speak of the design of the book and the content of the book, because since his collaboration with Rem Koolhaas, I think the design and Paolo Antonelli in the movie Mao by Jono and Benjamin Bergman really demonstrates plastically how the typography becomes an accumulation and meaning itself. But I have to say, Bruce, and please contradict me and shoot me if I'm wrong. If I look to the Nexus compared to Mao MC24 or Massive Change, I think this book to me looks a little bit like as a book designer, you have been going back to some of your earlier work with zone books. There is a different approach. There is a more I would say almost minimalistic approach to the actual book design. How do you see it in your trajectory as a book designer? So it's actually a bit of a peculiar question, maybe.
No, I think it's a good question. I think at one point I realized this may be the best book design that I've done, in the sense that the synthesis for Julio and I was really deep. And Julio mentioned the kind of diagram, the chart that he made early on, and I have been doing Nexus my whole life, trying to, I started, when I was in high school, I was intending to be a scientist, and kind of at the last moment became an artist and studied art. And so it's really always been kind of part of my, mind and my language and my imagination to kind of bring these worlds together, but I never named it as such. And when Julio showed me the little chart, I was so blown away, because what he had done was to look at the 3 domains of art, technology, and science, and 23 dimensions, 23 different, it wasn't so complete then, but it was, that going that way, looking at all the different dimensions of the domains to understand how they are different, how they're the same, what are the kind of, what happens, what operates, what's the operating system within each of the domains, and what's the language that you need to kind of develop to be able to synthesize those worlds. Mm-hmm. And so for me, this book is really a book where the subject of the book is really the practice of my life and my creative design practice. And so the synthesis, I think, was really quite something quite special. And in some ways more than any other book that I've ever worked on, because it was itself the subject of the work. And so for me, the collaboration was, as Julio said, super easy. It was 10 years of coffee and 3 years of Zooms, and something like that. And it was really one of the great intellectual adventures of my life. I mean, Julio is a very, he's quite modest, but he's a very special intelligence and very special talent. Being a painter and a scientist, being someone who actually is a Nexus person, he really understands what that means. And we had collaborated earlier on a practice at Northwestern that he called whole brain engineering. It was really introducing, in some ways, a kind of early Nexus model to say, look, we not only need quantitative excellence, we need qualitative excellence too. We need the whole brain to do the best possible work. And it really, I think, was quite radical to introduce that.
Yeah. Actually, one of the concepts that you present in the book is that of the blurification. And that's a concept Filiberto and I found in our research, in our practice as well from another side. We did,
Before you go there, Marco, because
yes,
you guys never disagree. I always disagree with Marco. It's probably because we are from these different, sides of Italy, different countries of Italy.
It's also quite rare that there are two guys from Torino, as in this case, to battle him.
One, it's already enough for me usually. So, but anyway, before we discuss about the blur, I really like the origin story because it feels very natural. No, it's like you plant a seed and then little by little it grows and you nurture it. Of course, you need to water it, and then there wasn't a decision. Let's do this together, or there wasn't a lot of contrast. Feels very natural in that sense. But what is Nexus? What does it mean? Why Nexus?
Of course.
Before we go and talk to the blur, can you explain that to me?
So
and to our viewers.
No. The Nexus is, to me, the place where the people who are part of that, the Nexus, have simultaneously the ability to look at things with more than one pair of glasses. Okay, so people go to university and get trained. You go to the law school to learn how to think like a lawyer. You go to medical school to think how to think like a doctor in different specialties. And economics the same way. These economists learn a language which they never have to explain to anybody because you live within that circle of economists or lawyers. So the question is, if you are in one of those domains and you are faced with issues that require creative thinking, most of the ideas that will emerge as things that were kind of already existing in that domain, okay? What if somehow you could acquire a second pair of glasses that will allow you to see reality in two ways at the same time, okay? And there's no recipe to do this. You have to have the desire of doing it. But the idea is that if you could look at things with the eyes of a scientist and with the eyes of an artist at the same time, being in this space that we call the Nexus, you will have a much richer set of possible ideas. The thinking space will increase. The downside may be that some of the ideas that will come to you will be kind of diametrically opposed. But the ability of, we say that that's also good, because the ability of handling contradictions, I mean, if you never have to handle contradictions in your life, I think you probably have a very narrow lens. You see everything with one lens, and there are lots of examples in the world of single lens viewing of things. So the Nexus is the place where these modes of thinking coexist, at least in the minds of individuals. But we make the point that this also applies to teams. There could be Nexus teams. A Nexus team probably, in order to function, has to have some connective tissue there that are probably these Nexus thinking people. But the team itself could be something that operates in this enriched space that we call the Nexus. Sorry, the explanation is kind of long, but that's my view of it. Maybe Bruce has a shorter one.
Well, I have a kind of purpose for the Nexus, which is that the challenges we now face don't fit so neatly into the classical categories. They are really higher order complexity challenges, and therefore they really need the Nexus perspective. They need a way, we need a way of looking at them in new ways, because imagining that you're going to solve these new problems with the old categories is not really plausible. So, that's what we really saw when we did massive change. And so when Julio began talking about the nexus and the synthesis, for me, it was very natural to say, of course, that's where we have to go. That's what we're going to need if we're going to be successful in this new world.
Yeah. Well, actually, before going to before going to the blur, because before touching on the blur, you mentioned the Nexus team, and in the book and also in the recent interview with Fast Company, you speak of a Renaissance team as opposite to a Renaissance man. In this book, there is a lot about Italian Renaissance. There is a lot about Florence, Brunelleschi, and Leon Battista Alberti. I wanted to ask you, what would be the ideal Renaissance team in your perspective, and why is a Renaissance man not feasible any longer, as you eloquently articulate in the book and with other interviews?
So I let Bruce handle that, but let me just give you one framing concept about. There is no way now that, for example, you could talk about a complete mathematician. The last one that fit that category, and we talk about him in the book, was Jules Henry Poincaré. He was the last complete mathematician, the last universalist. In the same way that it's not possible to have a complete mathematician, in many other areas, you cannot have a complete anything. Physics is too broad to have one complete physicist. And so our expectations for what completeness is as something embodied in an individual have to be kind of scaled down a little bit. But that doesn't mean that you cannot expand the concept to a team that has all the components.
Yeah, and that's really where the Renaissance team comes from. It was first named by Bill Buxton, who became our chief scientist in our studio. Even though I really didn't have a job for chief scientist, he declared that he was our chief scientist. And he began showing up and helping us when we were working on massive change. And he said, Bruce, what you're really doing here is a Renaissance team. You can't have a Renaissance person anymore because the scale of the knowledge is so great. But you can assemble a Renaissance team. You can put together a group of people who together really embody that special experience of the Renaissance, and who together bring the talent and the knowledge and the sensibility of that. But you need to understand what that means, and you need to understand how to be a team player. What it means to contribute at that level, and it takes a special kind of sensibility and talent, but also skill to do it. And really, that's what we explore in the book. Try to understand, what does it take to work in this new way? What are the lessons we can learn, and therefore the skills we can develop?
Roberto?
Do you want to talk about the blur? The blur now, Marco?
Yes, now we can talk about the blur. Now we actually, I was really triggered because Filiberto and I did a study about the impact or future developments derived from the digitalization, in essence. And we started with the hypothesis that due to the digitalization, you don't have leisure time and work time. You have a continuum, because you can sit in your bedroom at midnight exchanging emails about a contract with another continent, or you can be at your office and book your holidays on your mobile. So we explored these with 23, if I remember well, people from industry design, and this was 2017. We had Paolo Pininfarina of Pininfarina. We had people from fast-moving consumer goods, pharmaceutics, and we wrote a kind of white paper. Then we converted this white paper into a peer-reviewed paper for World Leisure Journal in 2020, and we brought along some insights from the pandemics, because of course during the pandemics the blurring of physical spaces and digital spaces became radically fast and extreme. It was just for me a coincidence to see that you also in the Nexus propose the notion of the blur, and of course you propose it from a different angle. So I wanted to ask you, what's your view on the blurring, and what do you think this says about the future?
By the way, can I comment something before? You also mentioned 23. So this, the 23 pair of chromosomes that humans have. It's remarkable that we have 23 accidentally. We can pretend otherwise.
Yeah, it's totally accidental. It was a summer. I remember some interviews I went to perform in summer suits that were like completely coming from a steam room at the end of the interview, because I was in Torino when I met Paolo Pininfarina, and it was like 38 degrees and 80% humidity. So it's a pure coincidence that after the 23rd, I could not, and Filiberto could not survive any longer, so we stopped. But
okay, so Bruce, regarding the question, if you still remember it, can you tackle that one?
Sure. I mean, for me, the idea of boundaries and crisp lines between disciplines is really less and less plausible. That you can see in almost everything that we're doing, like you suggest, that we are putting things together in new ways, combining things, hybridizing, synthesizing, and ultimately, I think what the Nexus as a project really proposes is that it's the synthesis that is really the kind of skill and talent of the future that we're going to need to develop. That ultimately we need to solve the kinds of problems that we had. And if you think about the way that we approached the problems was that we extracted the problem like an object from its context, and then applied design to that kind of falsely singular thing, imagining that you could kind of take it out of context. And then, once we had a one-to-one problem solution equation developed, we put it back into context. And of course, it produced all kinds of new problems. We solved that one, but it produced the ecosystem problems that we now have today. And the idea that the ecosystem problems are going to be solved by old category solutions is really not plausible. When I talk to Julio about life-centered design, which is really the practice that we're kind of dedicated to and developing, his response is such a clear articulation was, you're not going to solve climate change with human-centered design. Right? Like when you think about if we're obsessed with the human experience, we miss the big picture. We miss the big lens. And Julio has, I think his kind of metaphor of the big, seeing the big picture, seeing the big lens, and really beginning to kind of synthesize at that level is for me what that really is about. And that means blurring the bounds and blurring the categories to really create new kinds of practices. And that's where I think the kind of great opportunity is. And so for me, when I begin to think about that, I think, well, where are the people who already do this? Who are the people who naturally do it? And so we look at cinema. Cinema is a practice of synthesis and blurring that, almost like nothing else. I mean, we have literally, you look at the credits for a big production, and it's, sometimes hundreds, even thousands of people. But you have a kind of synthesis of all of that into a clear, beautiful, coherent, singular experience, and you can kind of make that happen. And similarly in architecture, you have hundreds of inputs to generate one coherent output. And I think that practice of synthesis is really for me, that's the future of design.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, it makes sense. But here comes the challenge from our perspective, where what we observe is the also blurrification of industries and boundaries between industries, with the competition coming from traditionally non-adjacent sectors. Let's talk about an example. If you think about self-driving cars and automotive, besides the fact that in that context, the traditional automotive players are basically seeing competition coming from all directions, there is also a component of healthcare as an automotive platform right now. Travel and lodging as an automotive platform right now, where the travel industry and the hotel industry is thinking of adding, self-driving cars as part of the experience to improve the relationship with the customers, and so on and so forth. All possible futures, of course. Mm-hmm. So in that context, a lot of industry players are concerned about margins and making money, and how they see potential big cakes in their future, but how they see their actually current cake shrinking. So how do we inspire them? How do we get them to also deal with the bigger problem and the bigger elephant in the room when they are concerned with the reshaping of the industry, and then having most of them hard time understanding what's going on? So how do we drive them to do the change that they need to do in the direction we want them to go, in that sense?
So in the book, we have the picture of two motorcycles from Harley Davidson. One 1912 that has one cylinder and a leather belt. And we put the 1913 because in that year they went to two cylinders and a chain belt. And that second picture is the one that carried Harley Davidson until maybe 5-6 years ago, okay? But at some point you have to be aware that all the experience and knowledge that you accumulated in even fine-tuning the sound of, because Harley Davidson was about the experience, they were selling an experience. At some point, nothing of that matters when it's clear that e-bikes are coming in to the horizon. And I think even though there's only one Harley Davidson, almost every other company has to have an example like that clear in front of their eyes, because almost everything at some point will be disrupted, okay?
Well,
and the sooner, sorry?
No, in the book you mentioned the name of the, I think, the inventor and business leader of a Polaroid at some point, and there used to be only one Polaroid, or there used to be Polaroid as the leader, and that's a little bit the same, that technological innovation is disruptive of categories.
Absolutely.
Almost automatically.
The case of Edwin Land is, we didn't put this in the book. Edwin Land in his time was more famous than Steve Jobs ever was. Exactly. He was advising presidents and so on and so forth in the middle of the Cold War. And the question during that time was how to get the pictures that the U-2 planes were shooting over Russia. And this was declassified recently. People think that Edwin Land never wanted to go beyond what is basically a chemical processes to produce film, like in Polaroid. But he was one of the few people advocating in this circle of advisors to the president about digital technology. And this was in the middle of the Cold War. And he was advocating this privately, but he never changed that in Polaroid itself. So, but that's a clear case of transition. Everything that you had accumulated in knowledge on how to polish lenses, even if you are in classical photography, producing Hasselblads and whatever famous camera was there made in Germany, nothing of that helped you when the transition went to digital. So I think no matter where you are, even in science, I think you have to be prepared that at some point people will say, you know what, we heard enough about you going in this direction. We need to go in another one. And the sooner you kind of get prepared for this seismic change of that awaits to all of us, the better you will be prepared to deal with it.
Yeah. Bruce?
Yeah, I think, if you follow that line, you get to Kodak, and the digital camera was actually invented at Kodak. And the inventor made a demonstration. He patched together this kind of prototype, and he showed that you could make images and show them on a television. And he did some 200 presentations within the company, including to the board. And the people at the board level said, who wants their pictures on the TV? and they invented the thing that killed them. I mean, it's really, an incredible story of what, how this kind of inevitable disruption and this kind of change of scale, right? Because they thought it was ugly. And it's a really, it's a kind of classic Nexus problem. They thought it was ugly. They thought it wasn't, who would want that when they could have Kodachrome?
So there are two examples that come more from the science side of things. So in the past, a chemist of first rank, a really respected chemist, was the one who could imagine a molecule, imagine what properties it would have, and then find a way of making the molecule, okay? And then something happens that was completely inelegant and was what is called combinatorial chemistry, okay? That you have a process in which you produce in one shot 1,000 variations on that molecule. And the idea is one of them has to be good, okay? In the same way that the people who are working on artificial intelligence in the 60s and 70s, what these people wanted to find was the algebra of thought, the elementary building blocks that can produce human consciousness, okay? And for these people, all of these things about machine learning is inelegant. It's just brute force. It is like producing paintings by variations on a computer. But the point is, you have to be prepared for this. May not be elegant, but it's inevitable. And at some point, you have to kind of accept reality. And maybe you always need the kind of odd duck pursuing something that doesn't go in the mainstream, okay? But the question is, how many acolytes you can have if you have some way of thinking that is completely orthogonal to the way that everybody thinks. And so those two are coming more from science. There are very few people now, chemists like they were in 1950s, and clearly almost everything now about machine learning and artificial intelligence is not like what people imagine in 1960 and 17, but people who were working at that point involved people with degrees in philosophy, for example. I don't know where those people are, but the massive change that took place moved more in the direction of what those guys will have called brute force.
Yeah. Roberto?
So how do we, and I understand the examples, and in a way, it seems to me that CEOs and leadership in companies are more scared about this Kodak/blockbuster scenario than they are, though, about climate change. Because a lot of them are really pretending to do something about it. So can the Nexus really help making this landmark change for companies?
I think one of the ways is to show, and it's one of the things we do in the book, is to show the impact of what happens when you really think at the Nexus. If you take the work of Apple or Pixar or Disney, these are Nexus companies. And if you take a company like Apple and you take beauty out of it, you would be left with a reasonably good technology company that you've never heard of and would have accomplished very little and really changed nothing. But when you put beauty into it, the way that Jobs really did, he understood, he was, intuitively a Nexus person. He understood that that design was really the kind of methodology that would change things. And he synthesized that and produced Apple. And you create the most valuable company in the history of the world. And I think the fact that business leaders don't see that and copy it is, for me, really shocking. That you have to explain it when it's so obvious that there's a reason that they put designed in California on their products, because where it's manufactured is inconsequential. But the design culture, in the same way that Florence produced the Renaissance, the culture of the design place really produces the effect and produces a Nexus culture capable of changing the world. And that's really what happened.
But sorry, please.
No, one thing that we mentioned very much in passing in the book, and this is based on conversations I had with a friend who is in marketing here, is when at some moment in the past or now, a company manages to fuse two things that normally go in separate ways, like engineering excellence and raw emotion. Okay, but that's what Ferrari was able to do. How they will manage this going to electric cars, God knows. But the idea that you can have two things that people in their minds intertwine, but in most cases are separate, there are many instances where this can happen. In some cases, you will probably hide one because you want the image. For example, I think we mentioned in the book a company who has the most amount of data about everything and probably really bad marketing is Facebook. Okay, because it's all analytical and not emotionally driven. But then there are companies that they look completely emotionally driven, like many luxury companies, the ones under Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. They clearly have the analytical part backing them up, but they hide the analytical part because what they are selling is all the creative part. So I think if you look under the hood, you'll find many cases in which these two things are intertwined. In some cases visibly, like in the Ferrari case, in other cases hiding one more part because it's not part of who they project they are, but you need both parts. Which, by the way, one thing that we talk in the book, and it was in reference to what Bruce was telling us about extracting a problem and solving it, but losing the context. Something that we, at least in conversations, we always say clearly is that there is no big prize for solving correctly what turns out to be the wrong question.
Yeah.
And that's a very common instance of over analytical thinking and trying to use tools too quickly because you make the problem conform to something that you have seen before. But in doing that, you lose all the context that made the problem complex.
It's a really good point. And, we've developed what we call a product agnostic practice. In other words, we don't start with the solution being something that we know. So if you ask an architect what the solution is to a problem, the solution will be a building. A product designer will say the solution is a product, and the graphic designer will tell you the solution is graphic design. Whereas if you simply say, we're product agnostic, let's look at the problem and allow the problem to synthesize the solution, to produce the solution that we need. If you can keep that discipline, and it really goes back to the blur that you were talking about. We don't start knowing that the solution to that problem is going to be a specific kind of object. We say, let's look at the problem holistically, and especially ecologically, from a complex contextual ecosystem, to try to understand what really is happening. That will lead us to the solution. And it may be, it may be nothing at all, actually. I've worked on projects where the answer was to do nothing. And, the client didn't expect,
notably the MoMA.
The client didn't expect it. But sometimes that is the right one. That is the answer. But that that's only allowable in a Nexus world where you can actually focus really on the synthesis and not on the object.
Well, you brought a lot of Italy from where Filiberto and I are. You brought Ferrari, Brunelleschi, Florence, the Renaissance, and I would like to do something a bit unconventional to wrap up the interview. This is a book. It's normally not advisable to show a book when you are launching a book, but this is a book I wrote a review about a couple of years ago. It's called Past Futures, Science Fiction, Space Travel, and Post-War Art of the Americas. And basically, it's based on a show curated by Sarah J. Montrose. It's covering Southern American, Latin American art about the future and space in the 1960s. And it has, at one page, there's a 1968 poster of a show, Los Argentinos en la Luna, Argentinians on the moon. And I wrote a book review about this project. And this is a 1968 collective exhibition. In 1970, the Argentinian pavilion at the Venice Biennale was all about chemistry, biology, and the future. And I made a comment that in 1968 was just before the very tough 1970s in Argentina, but still the Argentinians were radically optimistic, and they were dreaming of conquering the moon as Argentinians. Now, my question would be perhaps in a sort of elevator pitch, but how will the Nexus embody this radical optimism to bring not only the Argentinians, but us all to a preferable future, which is not going to be the moon, because in the meantime we conquered it. But how will the Nexus bring us forward from the point of view of radical optimism, which is the characteristic, one of the characteristics of Bruce's practice and work?
Bruce, that's your specialty. Optimism.
Yeah. I think it is. I hadn't really thought this through, but now that you've mentioned it, I think Nexus does demand optimism. It demands the belief that we will be able to synthesize and bring these worlds together. So it starts from the premise that that we will have the capacity to do that, even though the worlds themselves, and Julio really kind of maps it out beautifully in the book. The worlds themselves are becoming more and more complex, demanding, and challenging, and scaling at an exponential pace that makes that synthesis more challenging. But the belief in the Nexus is a belief in possibility, and in the human imagination.
And also, even though cases are singular, and there is always some drawback to every case, okay? At some moments in the past, even if briefly, I wouldn't say humanity, but a few people were able to come together and produce outputs that could have been inconceivable if these people were separate. So we pick a couple of examples in there. Some of them lasted only for 14 years, like the Bauhaus. We're still kind of living with consequences of those 14 years. Other ones, not so well known by, you know this, but many people would not. Black Mountain College, for example. But I think that this confluence of talents merging together in a new whole, the expectation is that they will keep occurring. And so if I'm optimistic, is on the belief that those things will happen and we'll be able to tackle problems that we think are impossible to solve now, but it's just based on human record of being able to repeat the things that my optimism is based.
Well, thank you so much, Julio Mario, and thank you, Bruce, of course. The Nexus is just out with MIT Press. There are 5 online posters that are microcult digital objects that capture some of the key messages of the Nexus. There is a sort of newsletter with press and with audio contributions, which is all available. I think it's just like every book where Bruce has been involved, it's going to be a milestone, and it's going to be, I remember the book with Rem Koolhaas was the Bible of the desktop revolution on the desk of every graphic designer of the time, and it will surely carry forward the vision and the mission. Filiberto, would you like to wrap up?
No, I just wanted to, thank you, gentlemen. It's been really a pleasure and an honor having you with us today, talking about the Nexus. Very inspiring conversation. I wish you all the best with the book, and keep us in mind in the future. We would love to have the opportunity to chat with you again.
Fantastic.
Yes. And
Thank you
next
so
week we are going to have as our guest Busy Williams, and we're going to extend the discussion and the dialogue about the Massive Change Network, the Mao documentary, and some of the ideas we shared today with Busy Williams just in 1 week from now. Thank you so much, Bruce Mao, Julio Mario Tino, and thank you, and stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Arrivederci.
Thank you. Delightful.
Grazie, arrivederci.
Ciao.